As Johar Tsarnaev goes on trial for the bombing of the Boston Marathon, Europe shakes from the assassination of magazine journalists in Paris and other incidents across the continent. Governments everywhere emit loose talk of fundamental values. Patriotic slogans such as Boston Strong paper over anxiety as everyone now prepares for further massacres and retributions. Welcome to the New World Order ought to be the slogan of Boston's bid for the 2024 Olympics, instead of whatever it is now. My name is John Summers, and on behalf of the Bafra magazine, I'd like to welcome you to this neighborhood forum on the war on terror and the rule of law. We present Noam Chomsky, author of 9/11 and many other books on politics and international affairs, and Cade Crockford, director of the ACLU of Massachusetts Technology for Liberty project. We meet tonight, of course, in the heart of Inman Square, the same neighborhood where the alleged perpetrators of the marathon bombing lived, worked, shopped, and worshipped among us. Take a left out of the lily pad and walk up a few blocks, and over on Norfolk Street, you will find the apartment where the brothers lived. Walk a few more blocks up Norfolk Street, and you'll find the Bafra's office. I myself live right around the corner. The point is that even for those of us who are not affected directly by the violence, this is a hard case not to take personally. So we wanted a community forum that would run in parallel to the first part of the judicial proceedings, the most important domestic terrorism trial since Timothy McVeigh was tried for the Oklahoma City bombings in 1995. Because we felt a near total absence of discussion about the ongoing damage done to our legal, political, and civil institutions. As the trial begins, there is a sense in which we are once again being asked to shelter in place, to stop asking the uncomfortable questions. So we're here tonight, among other reasons, to defy any such expectation, to air alternative views of the new turn in the war on terror, and to imagine what we can do to prevent the war technique in its numerous permutations from becoming a permanent part of our civil life, from the neighborhood on up. Cade Crockford will speak first, after which Noam Chomsky will speak. At that point, I'll come back to the podium and we'll take questions and open everything up for Q&A. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me? Excellent. So thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks to the Bafra for putting this on. There are definitely a host of troubling questions raised by the trial itself, as well as the circumstances surrounding the Tsarnaev brothers and the case against Johar. We can start with the trial. First of all, the trial should not be held in the city of Boston. The McVeigh case is a good example of a counterpoint. That trial was not held in Oklahoma for very good reason, because the judge agreed with the defense that the population in Oklahoma City, could not basically put forth an impartial jury to look at the facts without bias in that case. And clearly, as we've seen over the past week or so here in Boston, Judge O'Toole's decision to reject numerous defense motions to move this trial out of Boston was the wrong decision. The voir dire process has gone badly thus far. Every day we hear on the radio and read in the press stories about people who are asked questions by the prosecution and the defense and answer things like, X person in my family was directly related to the bombing in Y way, or, I work for the company that sponsored the Boston Marathon, or I live down the street from Richard Donahue, the little boy who lost his life that day, and I cry about it every single day. It's very difficult to imagine, particularly given that the Department of Justice has already said in motions to the court that it intends to present an argument that not only the entire city of Boston was victimized by this attack, but that the entire state of Massachusetts was traumatized and victimized. They then want to turn around and say that it's possible to field an impartial jury. Well, we've seen that that is going to be difficult, if not impossible. So there's the voir dire issue. another really important thing that people need to realize about this trial is that it's a death penalty trial, as you know. But what a lot of people don't know about death penalty trials is that they're more likely to convict. They're more likely to be composed of people with right-wing politics, white people, men, women, people of color, and people with left-wing politics, are more likely to oppose the death penalty. And if you oppose the death penalty, you cannot sit on this trial. So right off the bat, we have a major problem. U.S. Attorney Carmen Ortiz, widely despised both by the computer privacy and security community as a result of her persecution of Aaron Swartz, and the Muslim community as a result of her persecution of Tariq Mahana, a pharmacist from Massachusetts a few years back on dubious material support for terrorism charges, has plowed ahead, said, no, we should hold the trial in Boston, has said, we should go for the death penalty, although that was ultimately a decision made by Eric Holder. And I find it confounding, not just because it is going to ensure that this trial drags on for decades and costs taxpayers millions and millions of dollars through appeal after appeal, but also because the death penalty is illegal in Massachusetts. The voters have said multiple times that we oppose execution by the government as a form of punishment. In fact, the Boston Globe did a study I believe last year, and they found that even Boston residents opposed execution for Jahar Tsarnaev himself. So this flouts the will of the public, and because of the tendency for death penalty juries to convict, the propensity for them to convict, it also, I think, threatens Jahar's Fifth Amendment right to due process. So those are just a couple of the issues. There are lots more. 60% of the motions in this trial are sealed, so the public doesn't know what's going on the vast majority of the time in this case. There are allegations from the defense that it's been very difficult for them to find witnesses who will testify on behalf of Jahar Tsarnaev, in part because of FBI intimidation. That's not terribly surprising, given what happened to Ibrahim Tarashev, a former friend of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's, who was gunned down by an FBI agent from the Boston office in his Orlando apartment about 3 weeks or a month after the Boston Marathon bombings. That incident raises a whole host of questions related to a triple murder that took place in Waltham in 2011 on the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, believe it or not. At the time, the DA, District Attorney Jerry Leone, told the public that his office believed that it was likely two assailants who were let into a home known to the victims and killed those three people, Brendan Mess, Eric Weissman among them. Brendan Mess, reportedly one of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's best friends. We hear a month after the Marathon bombing that Ibrahim Tarashev was penning a confession to those murders when he flipped out, threw a table. First we heard it was a broomstick, then a knife, then something else, attacks the FBI agent in the midst of writing this confession, implicating himself and Tamerlan Tsarnaev in those murders. And he's killed. He's gunned down by the FBI. Well, subsequently, as journalist Susan Zalkin has documented, both for This American Life and Boston Magazine, the FBI proceeded to harass, intimidate, deport basically everybody who knew Ibrahim Tarashev. So some sort of bizarre cleanup operation taking place in Florida. Again, we're told at that time that the government has evidence through a leak to Michelle McPhee in ABC News that Tamerlan Tsarnaev did kill those three people in Waltham. The press reports that the government has forensic evidence and cell phone location records. Curious to know where those records were for 2 years when those murders were unsolved. A week after the bombing, suddenly the government has evidence pointing to Tamerlan's involvement, but the case was cold for 18 months before that. Sort of bizarre. even more strange still is that just this past, I believe, maybe a couple months ago, I'm not sure exactly when it was, Jahar's lawyers submitted a request asking for the prosecution to give them information about Tamerlan's involvement in those murders. And the DOJ came back with something that I found to be really shocking. They said, we have no evidence of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's involvement in the triple murders in Waltham in 2011. So leaking to the press in May 2013 that Tamerlan killed those 3 people, and then telling a court in 2014 that they had no evidence that he was involved in those murders. This is a pattern that the government is engaged in, not just related to the Tsarnaev trial, saying something in public, usually through anonymous leaks, through reporters, and then saying something entirely different in court. It's happened with the CIA drone operations. John Brennan goes before cameras and says, we are engaged in righteous and precision strikes against terrorists. And then in court, when the CIA, when the ACLU asks for the drone memos, the CIA says we can neither confirm nor deny our involvement in those programs. Well, we've seen something similar happening in this case. So again, the leaks initially that Tamerlan was involved in the Waltham murders, just weeks after the Marathon bombings, a year later, Carmen Ortiz's office saying in court that they have no evidence of his involvement. And another strange thing, this I think the most disturbing question that I haven't seen nearly enough exploration of in the press, just days after the Marathon bombings in May of 2013, we read in CNN that through, again, anonymous law enforcement leaks, that the government has found forensic evidence that the bombs that exploded at the Marathon were built in Tamerlan's apartment just down the road. They said, we found explosives residue all over the place, in the kitchen, in the bathroom. You can look it up. The story is still on CNN.com. Well, a year later, in May 2014, Carmen Ortiz's office files a brief in court in US v. Tsarnaev that says the exact opposite. It says, we actually didn't find much of any evidence in Tamerlan's house, and we don't know who built the bombs. Well, that's quite an admission. And it's not the only time that the government has said that in court. In the Rebel Philippos trial, not sure if you remember him, he's the young man who was a friend of Jahar's, who was yoked up on false statements charges by the FBI, had no involvement in the crime, was prosecuted for essentially lying to federal agents, is going to spend time in prison as a result of that. During his trial, an FBI agent said in public, again, in front of reporters, one of whom tweeted this, that the FBI does not know who built the bombs that blew up at the Boston Marathon. So here we have Jahar Tsarnaev, 21-year-old kid, bearing the full weight of the government's prosecution of this terrorist crime. And the government is, at the same time, admitting that it doesn't know who built the bombs that exploded at the Marathon. I find that to be alarming, particularly given the government's omnipotent surveillance state that it directs at all of us. So Edward Snowden, in the wake of the bombings in 2013, said the reason why the NSA and the FBI didn't catch this guy is because they were spying on you instead. There's a lot of truth to that. It sounds flippant, but I read in the New Yorker this week a piece called The Whole Haystack. I encourage you to look it up. And in that piece, it opens with a really alarming statement that I also believe is true. It says, the vast majority, if not all, of the major terrorist attacks that have occurred on Western soil since 9/11 have been perpetrated by people who were known to law enforcement. This is not, and the same is true with Tamerlan. The same is true with Tamerlan. He was investigated by the FBI, they admit, for months at least. His defense team says that the FBI asked him to become an informant for the government, a claim that Senator Chuck Grassley asked FBI Director James Comey about in an October 2013 letter that he got an insufficient response to, in my view. But the fact remains that the majority, if not all, of the major terrorist attacks that have occurred in the United States and in Europe since 9/11 have been perpetrated by people who had been investigated at some point by law enforcement. So the notion that the government should be recording details of every phone call we make, which is what they do, sucking up vast quantities of our private communications through surveillance programs conducted by the NSA, as well as other government agencies, which they do, in order to stop terrorism, is clearly bogus. These dragnet surveillance programs do not have any effective impact on stopping terrorism. Surveillance of this sort, as Snowden has said and other dissidents have said repeatedly over time, not just in the digital age, but since the Stasi, surveillance of this sort exists for political, social, and economic control, for purposes of control, not for public safety. And I don't think that we could have a clearer example here in Boston than the Boston Marathon.
Well, I actually don't have anything to add about the terrorist acts in Boston and how they're being handled. So what I'd like to try to do instead is to bring up some more general reflections and concerns about the issues of terrorism, what they raise, and what we can do about it. Let me begin with something that may seem pretty far afield. A film review in the New York Times a couple days ago. It begins, I'll quote it, by ridiculing America's coastal intelligentsia, which busied itself with chatter over little-seen art dramas, while everyday Americans showed up en masse for a patriotic, pro-family picture, which broke all attendance records in its opening days. At the end of this quite laudatory review, the reviewer mentions that there was another film that opened same time, but with quite limited attendance, Selma, which was timed for release with Martin Luther King Day. Well, what was the patriotic pro-family film that so entranced everyday Americans? It's about the most deadly sniper in American history, a guy named Chris Kyle, who claims to have used his skills to have killed several hundred people in Iraq. And he wrote memoirs, and in the memoirs he describes what the experience was like. So I'll quote him. His first kill, he said, was a woman who walked into a street with a grenade in her hand as the Marines attacked her village. Chris Kyle, killed her with a single shot and explains how he felt about it. I hated the damn savages I've been fighting. Savage, despicable, evil. That's what we were fighting in Iraq. That's why a lot of people, myself included, called the enemy savages. There was really no other way to describe what we encountered there. The film, I read a lot of the reviews. I haven't seen the film, incidentally, but I read reviews of it. So they varied. The New Yorker thought it was great. They kept to the cinematic values. It was well done, nice photographs and so on. There were others who found it appalling. One of them was Jeff Stein. He's a former U.S. intelligence officer, worked in Vietnam, and he wrote a very critical review, keeping to the content. And he also recalled a visit that he made. He was invited visit to at a Marine base to a clubhouse for snipers. And I'll quote him, the bar room walls featured white on black Nazi SS insignia and other Wehrmacht photos and regalia. The Marine shooters clearly identified with the marksman of the world's most infamous killing machine rather than with regular troops. Well, going back to Chris Kyle, he regarded his first kill as a terrorist. This woman who walked into the street with a grenade when the Marines were attacking her village. But we can't really attribute that to the mentality of a psychopathic killer, because we're all tarred with the same brush, at least insofar as we tolerate or keep silent about official policy. So take, for example, the case of Omar Khader. Omar Khader is it's the first case that was brought to trial, what's called a trial, a military trial in Guantanamo, first case under Obama. This Guantanamo prisoner. He was apprehended when he was a 15-year-old child. He was in a residential complex which was attacked by special ops, Delta Force. Their slogan is three Fs, find, fix, and finish. They shot him, wounded him badly, he's blinded. They didn't finish him. They had a discussion about whether to finish him off, but they decided instead to send him to Bagram Air Base, which is, it's not inspected by anyone, it's off limits, but from the reports of prisoners, it's the worst of the CIA torture chambers, apparently much worse even than Guantanamo, no inspection. He was there for a couple of years, then he was sent off to Guantanamo. Altogether, he spent 8 years in detention, torture, and so on, what you're familiar with. After 8 years, he was granted a trial, a military trial. His lawyers were told that he had two options. One was to plead guilty of the charge. The charge was like the woman in the village. He's alleged to have thrown a grenade when Delta Force attacked his residential complex. He could plead guilty, they said, in which case he would have 8 more years of imprisonment, or he could plead innocent, in which he'd be in there forever. So his lawyers advised him to plead guilty, which he did. He's a Canadian citizen, and at that point Canada finally intervened and said they would agree to take this deadly terrorist, 15-year-old kid, back to Canada. He'd serve the rest of his sentence there. Well, that's what we call a terrorist, just like Chris Kyle called the woman in the village a terrorist. And that mentality, there's very little commentary about this, incidentally, except for Amnesty International, ACLU, and so on. The mentality helps explain why it's so easy to ignore what is clearly the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern history, if not ever, Obama's global assassination campaign, the drone campaign, which officially is aimed at murdering people who are suspected of maybe someday planning to harm us. If that's what they're suspected of doing in the morning sessions with Brennan and so on, then we blow them away. And I'd really advise you to read some of the transcripts of the drone operators. They're hair-raising. The guys who are sitting in front of computers, in Las Vegas or somewhere. I can't repeat it. Obama, you may recall, when he won the Nobel Prize, said, make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. And he's right, and he knows exactly where to find it. There are lots of other examples that are quite pertinent today. So in the context of relaxing our, what's called renormalizing relations with Cuba, which means relaxing our relentless attack on Cuba for half a century, one thing that's ignored is a massive terrorist campaign that John F. Kennedy launched against Cuba. It almost brought the world to a terminal nuclear war, Cuban Missile Crisis, and after that it was immediately relaunched. This is ignored, dismissed. You find almost no reference to it except for some witticisms about silly CIA plots that didn't work to try to poison Castro or something like that, which did take place, but that's the least of it. And the same is true of numerous other atrocities by our side. Right after the latest famous terrorist atrocity, Charlie Hebdo, the head of the Israeli Labor Party, Isaac Herzog, he's the prime opponent of Netanyahu in the upcoming election, was quoted as saying, "Terrorism is terrorism. There are no two ways about it." That's quite wrong. There are two ways about it, and we know about it very well. We look quite differently at the retail terrorism that's done by them against us as compared with the wholesale terrorism that we carry out against them, which doesn't count. That's this observation is one of the most richly documented and well-established results in the large-scale study of terrorism in the past 30 years, ever since Ronald Reagan declared a war on terror as he came into office. Well, this usual, incidentally, it's hardly a new observation. So George Orwell defined what he called the nationalist. He said, the nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. And Orwell didn't go far enough. We also have a remarkable capacity for denying them or even lauding them, case after case. And this usual pattern was followed after the latest atrocity in Paris. The crime was vividly reported by the veteran Europe correspondent of the New York Times, Stephen Erlanger. He described the aftermath as a day of sirens, helicopters in the air, frantic news bulletins, police cordons, anxious crowds, young children led away from schools to safety. It was a day like the previous two of blood and horror in and around Paris. And Erlanger also quoted a surviving journalist who said, "Everything crashed. There was no way out. There was smoke everywhere. It was terrible. People were screaming. It was like a nightmare. There was a huge detonation, and everything went dark." Erlanger comments, the scene was an increasingly familiar one of smashed glass, broken walls, twisted timbers, scorched paint, and emotional devastation. As some of you may recognize, I'm cheating. That was not his report after the Paris Charlie Hebdo bombing. Rather, this was April 24th, 1999. Didn't make it to the front page. It was buried in an inside page. It wasn't terribly important. It was the U.S. Missile attack on Serbian state television. Headquarters knocked the radio television station off the air. Killed 16 journalists, several more than Charlie Hebdo. And Erlanger reports that American officials defended the attack as an attempt to undermine, his words, an effort to undermine the government that the U.S. was attacking, and therefore the radio television station was a legitimate target. Richard Holbrooke, distinguished diplomat, he was then the envoy to Yugoslavia. He described the successful attack as an enormously important and, I think, positive development. It was echoed by many others. There was an international, still is, international tribunal for a criminal tribunal for Yugoslavia. They were asked by some Canadian lawyers to look into the NATO attack, and they concluded that it was not a crime. But they did say, I'll quote them, that civilian casualties were unfortunately high, but they do not appear to be clearly disproportionate. That's in contrast to Charlie Hebdo, where obviously they were very much proportionate. I don't know proportionate to what, but that's the quote. Well, let's go back to Chris Kyle. Some of his exploits were in Fallujah during the Marine attack on Fallujah in November 2004, one of the worst war crimes of the invasion itself, the worst war crime of the millennium. Here it's regarded as an example of marvelous heroism of our soldiers in liberating Iraq. If you go back to the reporting of the Fallujah attack, it's extremely interesting. I happened to be in New York when it took place. I had some talks. I stopped all the talks, and each day just talked about the front page of the New York Times. The first day of the attack, the front page of the New York Times had a big picture, right in the front page, of a hospital. The Marines had attacked a hospital, which is, of course, a war crime. They had thrown, what the picture showed, the photograph showed, is that they had thrown the patients out of their beds and onto the floor, tied their hands behind their backs, done the same with doctors. There were some questions about it. The reporters asked, why attack the hospital? And they were told that the hospital was a legitimate target. The reason was that it was producing propaganda for the rebels, namely casualty figures. So therefore it was entirely legitimate to destroy this, to prevent this propaganda agency from continuing to spew forth its violent materials. Really easy to continue. I won't go on, but you should be able to add many more examples. One of the more interesting comments on the Charlie Hebdo crime was by a noted civil rights lawyer, noted for his vigorous defense of freedom of expression, Floyd Abrams. He sharply condemned the editors of the New York Times because they didn't publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons ridiculing Muhammad that elicited the terrorist assault. And that, he said, if they had done so, it would have properly served the cause of free expression in the immediate wake of the most threatening assault on journalism in living memory. He's actually right. The Charlie Hebdo attack was the most threatening assault on journalism in living memory. That's actually a comment on living memory and on us. Living memory is a category that is very carefully crafted, that we craft very carefully to include their crimes against us and to exclude scrupulously our crimes against them, comparable crimes, often worse crimes. These are not crimes. They're noble defense of the highest values. Maybe sometimes they're inadvertently flawed, like when, unfortunately, civilian casualties were high but not disproportionate. Well, all of this is a special case of a much more general doctrine, which is observed with really impressive dedication and consistency, namely, the more we can blame some crime on some enemy, the greater the outrage. The more we are responsible for it, and therefore incidentally can do something about it, to end it, the less the concern, sometimes tending to oblivion or even denial. Well, these questions and these considerations directly inform the question of what we can do about terrorism. It's serious. It's a serious problem. What can we do about it? Well, one easy suggestion comes to mind at once, that we can stop participating in it. We can stop carrying out large-scale terrorist atrocities. That would sharply reduce the amount of terrorism in the world, more than anything else I can think of. And incidentally, by doing so, we would also reduce that small component of terrorism that makes its way into living memory, namely what they do to us. It's well known, not questionable even, that the drone attacks are a very effective terrorist generating mechanism. Now, that's been demonstrated over and over. And in fact, if you take a look at the reports, extensive discussions of the terrorists in the Charlie Hebdo case, they made it very clear that what incited them to jihadism were things like Abu Ghraib, and the U.S. attack on Iraq, and other events of humiliation of Muslims and violence against them, not to speak of the conditions in the banlieue, the suburbs of Paris, where they're subject to contempt and harsh repression in the lives that while they try to survive. If you go to the Senate reports on on torture, they were quite interesting to read. They dealt with a single question: did it work? The question is, can you achieve results by torturing people? And they concluded that you couldn't achieve results, so therefore the liberal commentary on torture is it wasn't worth it. That's the limit of the official discussion. But there's pretty good evidence that that's irrelevant, because the evidence is pretty strong that getting results was not the purpose of the torture. This Cheney-Rumsfeld torture machine was initially designed for quite a different purpose, pretty explicitly. The purpose was to try to elicit some information, true or false, didn't matter. That's why it doesn't matter if you get false information from torture. Some information that would tie Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda, which was a crazy idea, but that's what they needed in order to justify the attack on Iraq that was planned. Now, that was the initial purpose of the torture, but it actually gets worse. The torture, quote now, was a lab. I'm quoting from a very well-documented study in the Seton Hall Law Journal, just came out, a study on what the government called the Battle Lab. The Battle Lab was seeking to obtain information on the most effective ways to torture a human physically, information on the most damaging ways to break a man psychologically, and insight as to just how far the human body could be pushed in pain and terror before organ failure or death. That's the Battle Lab. And that was a large component of the torture. They haven't really talked about Guantanamo. Other places are worse. Well, you can make what you like about that, but that's us, not somebody else. Similar questions arise about this vast surveillance system, which, as you know, detected essentially nothing. If the goal were to protect Americans, there are much more effective modes of surveillance that could easily be designed. For example, every home could have detectors in every room picking up everything that's going on, linked to the local police station and hospital. That would prevent many more deaths than have ever occurred from terrorism. I mean, deaths from accidents in home and domestic abuse are far greater than deaths from terrorism. So that's a pretty simple way to protect Americans by surveillance, if that's your interest. But the ugly truth of the matter is that security of the population is simply not a high priority for states. That's a matter of very great importance, one that there's no time to explore here, but I think it lies behind a lot of what we are discussing.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. So yeah, just a few things came to mind while I was listening to you talk, Noam. One is that I didn't get into as specifically as I wanted to the question about whether or not, if Tamerlan Tsarnaev did kill those 3 people in Waltham, the marathon bombings would have happened had he been apprehended before April 2013. It's an important question because it gets to an issue that affects the rest of us, as the forum here advertises, the question of dragnet surveillance, as Noam has identified, dragnet surveillance clearly doesn't protect public safety. There is something that protects public safety, which is individualized suspicion of wrongdoing. So if it's actually true that the government had evidence way back when, in 2011, that Tamerlan and Tsarnaev killed those 3 people, as they leaked to the press that they did after the marathon bombings, and he had been investigated for that specific crime, given that there was specific evidence of wrongdoing against him, it would have prevented the bombing because he would have been in prison having been convicted of killing 3 people. It's a really perfect, very condensed and locally relevant example of why individualized suspicion is actually a much better public safety policy than dragnet surveillance. Another thing that is so interesting about the Paris attacks specifically is that in the wake of the shootings, Al-Qaeda took responsibility for at least training some of the people who were involved, if not financing the operation. We don't know if it's true that they did that, but they took responsibility. They told Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept that they were responsible. And they also said something really interesting. They said, I'm paraphrasing, why is it okay for you to kill our propagandists and we can't kill yours? Now, you'll recall that the United States government announced to the world that it intended to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, a US citizen, with a drone before they did it. The ACLU, working with al-Awlaki's father, sued and said, hold on, you can't kill a US citizen without due process. This is absurd. All those lawsuits failed. And he was killed eventually. The US government killed him with a drone, a US citizen. They allege that he was operational. There's no evidence of this at all. He was a propagandist. There's plenty of evidence that he was a propagandist. They hated him because he spoke in English, and he spoke very eloquently, denouncing the United States government. They murdered him. They murdered him. They murdered Samir Khan, who was another US citizen, who edited the magazine Inspire, which you might have heard about, Al-Qaeda's English language propaganda outlet. So it's a question that is uncomfortable, I think, for the United States government and for the West more generally. Why is it okay to kill their propagandists and it's not okay to kill ours? Of course, I don't agree with killing any propagandists, but... And then on the question of the actual public safety threat that terrorism poses, there was a study done a few years back that showed that you're more likely to be killed by your furniture in the United States than you are by a terrorist. So literally, your television is more likely to fall on your head and kill you than you are likely to be killed by someone who has, political motives. So just consider that every time you hear the FBI and the NSA say that they need some new power or technology and even local police now to invade your rights to protect you. Are they going to do it to protect you from your television? Is really the question you should be asking.
There are quite a lot of interesting cases of how we've routinely, the U.S. goes after what it calls propaganda agencies and destroys them. I mentioned a couple, but some I saw firsthand. I happened to be, by accident, in Islamabad right at the time when the U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan. And of course, all the journalists in the world flocked to Islamabad because that was the way to get into Afghanistan. And if you've ever been in a place where a lot of journalists flock together, you'll know how it works. There's a couple of hotels. They hang around the hotel bars and they have fun and have drinks and talk to each other and so on. And the big joke among the journalists in the Islamabad hotel bar was about the U.S., the bombing of the Al Jazeera television radio outlet in Kabul. It had been attacked and destroyed by U.S. missiles. And the official story, which incidentally all the journalists reported, was that it was an accident. They were aiming at something else. Everyone in the bar was laughing about how ridiculous this is. Of course, they targeted the Al Jazeera office and destroyed it. But It's not the kind of thing you report. That's routine. You're quite right.
And the U.S. killed Al Jazeera journalists in Iraq as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions, and I think the easiest way to do it is I will call on you from here, and then we'll try to keep the discussion going. Yes, sorry. We don't have a wireless mic, so speak up so that everybody in the room can hear you.
So I read a very interesting report where they said in France, post the Charlie Hebdo attack, that the Muslim population of France is about 7.5% or something like that. But then the incarceration rate and the number of prisoners is like 70% of all prison inmates in France are Muslims from mostly Middle East or North African nations. You kind of see some sort of a trend here too in the US with mostly people of color and mostly black people and all that stuff. So what are the implications if we continue doing this? And you already see that the prisons are the hotbed for whatever they term as domestic terrorism within France and the radicalization of those populations. So what are the implications for a country like the US, which is disproportionately imprisoning people of color and immigrants?
Well, I think the implications are pretty clear. It's pretty much like defense against terrorism or surveillance. If the purpose of the so-called criminal justice system was to protect people, prevent crime, and so on, you wouldn't have these results. So that tells you the purpose is something else. What's the purpose? Just look at the results. In France, it's part of the raging Islamophobia, which is all over Europe, incidentally. My own feeling is that Europe's more racist than the United States. And one consequence is what you described. If you go out, I've visited the banlieue, these suburbs of Paris, where it was mostly North Africans. And the conditions are pretty awful. I've seen worse poverty, but they're pretty bad. But the worst thing, and the thing that people complain about, is the utter contempt that is felt towards them by those rich guys in Paris an hour away, and the way they're treated if they dare to get into Paris. This is, you have to live with this constant assault on your dignity, your personal rights. There's plenty of violence and repression too, unemployment, no hope, imprisonment. Well, out of that comes crime, what we call crime, but it has roots. Same in here, I don't remember the exact figures, you probably know them, but there's a highly disproportionate number of black males in prison, and not because they're genetically different. There's a history of 400 years since the first slaves came, which has a very strong residue. The current recent imprisonment explosion since Reagan is because of a very clearly racist drug war designed on racist grounds, from police action all the way through up to sentencing and even post-release treatment. End result, prisons are full of blacks. It happens to be a repetition of what happened after the Civil War. Go back to the Civil War, there were 10 years roughly in which blacks had a moderate possible access to being part of the world. After that, there was a North-South compact, which essentially told the slave states they could do whatever they liked. So what they did was criminalize black life. Pretty soon, the black male population was back in jail. Large part of a labor force for the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th, early 20th century. Now we're doing it again. It's been going on for 400 years now.
Kate, I noticed you tweeted something earlier this morning about how, I believe it was the judge said that the presumption of innocence is kind of just like a bon mot and not something to be really taken seriously.
A term of art is what he said.
Yeah, term of art. I was just wondering if, talking about the possibility or not possibility of moving the trial out of Massachusetts, do you even think it's possible in a sense to compose an impartial jury, especially considering stuff like that and the fact that if you admit in the jury selection process that you would ever doubt the word of a police officer, they just kind of reject you off the bat. Do you think there's any hope for the jury at all?
Well, yeah. I mean, the second question points to a larger problem in the criminal punishment system, right? That's not just about this trial. You're right. If you say you don't like cops or you distrust cops, you will never serve on any jury in this country. But certainly, yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, I don't think that that an impartial jury will be fielded in this case, even if the jury is impartial by O'Toole's standards, or even by the standards of the defense. I don't think that it's possible for there to be an impartial jury, given that this is a death penalty case. As I said before, you cannot serve on the jury unless you support execution as a political matter.
So in the discussion today, I think we've highlighted that there's mass deceit on part of the government, on the American people, and it's largely executed by the media, which is largely controlled by private entities that are also entangled within the government. And it's highlighting a huge problem that we're facing as a country, where we're going closer and closer to this police state Orwellian type way of living. So what can we do now, and where do you see that we can go to take a step back and kind of awaken the people in the country that are passively allowing this to continue and allow this country to be great once again?
I have an answer for that. First of all, you should support the budding Black revolutionary movement that's happening right now, sometimes known as the Black Lives Matter movement. As Noam said, Black people in this country are by far the most oppressed by the police and the court system, the legal system. So following the lead of Black activists, I think in that regard is quite important. But beyond that, as far as the police state, the surveillance state is concerned, and I don't think that those terms are hyperbolic, actually. As I said before, the government has kept records of every phone call you've made over the past 8 or 10 years, and every call you'll make tomorrow and the week after that, as well as many, many other forms of electronic surveillance that happen all the time to all of us, not people who are suspected of specific crimes. On those issues, I really strongly suggest that you go to your city council and try to deal with this issue at the local level, because Congress is not the place for it, in my view. We've seen that the intelligence committees are completely captured by the intelligence agencies. As Noam said, even the one decent report that we got out of the Senate Intelligence Committee recently focused mainly on the question of whether or not torture is effective, not whether it's illegal and immoral, which it is. And so, even in the wake of the Snowden revelations, we've seen very, very little movement in Congress on even the most milquetoast reforms to those surveillance programs. There's going to be an opportunity coming up because the Patriot Act is going to sunset. So Congress will actually have to affirmatively pass surveillance law. And so I think that's one possible place where we might be able to apply some pressure. But it's really very difficult. The intelligence agencies, so-called, have a lot of power in Washington, and I don't think that power will be easily dislodged. At the state and local level, however, we do have a much better chance. And one of the largest problems that I've seen over the past decade plus is that this huge flood of money from the federal government, from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, down to the state and local level to, essentially nationally securitized local police is threatening our rights in a very significant way. Unfortunately, most of what they're doing is behind closed doors. The FBI has been forcing local police departments to sign non-disclosure agreements to promise not to talk about specific surveillance technologies if asked by the public or reporters. This is just one among countless examples of ways in which the national security state is trickling down to the state and local level. So I think we do actually have power at the state and local level to push back, and I can talk to you more about that after if you're interested.
I appreciate your response. Probably should have clarified. I was curious, Noam, if you would mind giving me your feedback on the question.
On that question?
Thank you.
Well, think of that film that I mentioned that not enough people are going to see, Selma. What's it about? It's about the one of the later steps in a creation of a huge mass popular movement which compelled a very reluctant government to pass some limited rights that should have been available centuries earlier, but they did pass them. If you had asked, say, in 1960, what can you do about these things? The answer would have been nothing. Didn't look possible. But a couple of people did try to do things. A couple of black students sat in at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Immediately arrested, of course. Could have ended it, except that a couple more came back the next day. Pretty soon you had SNCC formed, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Freedom Riders going through the South, facing extreme violence, far worse than anything we can think of today in the country. Killing, murder, all kinds of attacks, but they kept coming. And the greatest courage was the black rural people who were willing to dare to get to register to vote. Finally, you got things like Selma, which was brutal and vicious, but it did get national attention enough so that it was possible to create large-scale public pressure that led Congress and the president to put through some legislative measures that did improve things. Things are much better than they were in many respects. So right now, the surveillance is really awful stuff, undoubtedly. But compare it to what was going on in the 1960s and early 70s, COINTELPRO. Nobody talks about that very much, but that was a program run by the National Political Police, the FBI, under 4 administrations. Started under Eisenhower, took off under Kennedy and Johnson, continued into Nixon. This was a program which started off, as always, with the Communist Party, but then expanded to just about everything. The women's movement, the New Left, the black movements were the main target. And it wasn't just surveillance. It went all the way up to political assassination, Gestapo-style political assassination, literally. Police breaking into the apartment of a black organizer, Fred Hampton, murdering him and another organizer, Mark Cook, in their beds, probably drugged 4 a.m. in the morning on false tips from the FBI. That's direct political assassination. It barely elicited any interest or attention, but it was severe, and there was plenty of it. It was finally terminated by the courts, not by Congress. Compared with that, we're pretty well off. It's not to say that it's good now, but it's been worse before.
We have a question here in the back.
Hi. I'm reminded in talking about all this of we're nearly 50 years from the death of Robert Kennedy at the hands of Sirhan Sirhan, who was a Palestinian man, and reminded of how little interrogation was done even at the time of his motives, which by his own kind of candid admission had to do with the deployment of 50 bombers by Robert Kennedy to assist in the Six-Day War to further shore up his Israeli defense forces. Now we have, I'm always moved to think of the note that Jahar Tsarnaev composed on the side of the boat when he was awaiting capture and bleeding. And he says something to the effect of, know that you are facing men who look down the barrel of a gun and see heaven. How can you compete with that? And then he said something else about the Ummah. Muslims are all one body. You hurt one of us, you hurt the rest of us. Stop killing our innocent people, and we will stop. And I wonder if someday someone will anthologize all these kind of lucid statements of terrorists whose methods we don't condone, and we'll say, geez, they were being pretty emphatic and clear for about 50 years at least. And I wonder how you account, the two of you, for our kind of radical ahistorical obtuseness in this half-century long war. I hear myself sounding very anti-patriotic, but it is my question. How on earth do we forgive ourselves for not internalizing a rather simple message? If that makes any sense. You started talking about it, but I'm just wondering if there's more. Thank you.
How do we forgive ourselves? We've got a lot to forgive ourselves about. Take the fact that we're wealthy, privileged people, as all of us here are, I suppose. Where'd that all come from? Well, actually, a large part of the wealth of the society, not just the United States, also England and the continent, came from slave labor camps, vicious slave labor camps of the kind that would have impressed the Nazis, literally, went on for over a century. Cotton was much more important than oil in the 19th century. It was the basis for the development of the modern economy. Manufacturing, finance, merchants, commodities, trade, all developed out of the cotton production. Where'd cotton production come from? Slave labor camps, vicious, murderous slave labor camps, where productivity, which were very efficient incidentally, the productivity in slave labor camps producing cotton, productivity increased faster than it did in industry. And there were no technological innovations, just the bullwhip and the pistol, and driving people harder and harder so they could produce more and more cotton, more and more rapidly, more and more efficiently. That's why we share in wealth and privilege, and not just us. So is that something to apologize for? Well, yeah, we do apologize for it by throwing them in jail and claiming that they're genetically inferior. That's why they do these bad things. And this has been going on, as I said, for 400 years in one form or another. There's also a small matter that actually was mentioned in the New York Times this morning, interestingly. There was an article on Junipero Serra, who was being considered for sainthood. He led the missions in California, which brought civilization to the Indians by exterminating them and Christianizing them. So he's a saint, or almost a saint, and will be. But to the credit of the reporter, whoever it was, it did quote Indian activists that said, look, there's another side to this. Extermination, destruction of our culture, stealing of our lands, and so on. Well, that didn't happen just in California. Right here where we are, the same thing happened a little earlier. Is that something to apologize for, to think about? It is. And there are plenty of other things. How do we do it? Well, that we have to ask ourselves.
Question here in the back. Over here. Thank you both. First of all, just for the record, there was a response when Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed. I was in New York City, and Richard Nixon actually came to get the National Football League award or something at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel 5 days later. And there was a pretty significant protest. Actually, it was the beginning, it was sort of the cusp of the beginning of what became the Weather Underground. Some of the people who actually took to the streets in a very militant way. Just for the record, it was Mark Clark, but that's fine. I have this feeling that a lot of the alleged, putting bombs in bathrooms is not the same as killing people. The violence, so-called violence of the movement that some people in the movement turn to, I've always felt was largely provoked by massive police violence that had preceded the resort to some of those tactics. I wonder if you, and I think it's consistent with what you're saying about their terrorism and our terrorism. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I'd also like to hear a little bit more about the case of the individual who was killed by the FBI in Florida. If there's a little more detail you could share about that. I remember hearing from Kevin Cullen and the woman who co-wrote a book with him that they were working on the story, but I don't remember whether there ever was a story in the Boston Globe really digging into what happened and the suspicions around potential police involvement in the characterization of that killing as a drug deal gone bad, because it was sort of marijuana spread all over everybody.
I'm sorry, which killing are you talking about? The one in Florida or the one in Waltham?
Those two,
Both of them.
yeah.
Okay. So what's the question about that exactly?
What else you might say about what is believed to have happened, or what the characterization of what happened, what actually happened during the interrogation, to the extent that there's been any evidence?
Wouldn't we love to know? Part of the problem is that there's been extreme, I think, unprecedented secrecy around the Waltham murder investigation and what happened in Florida. The Florida state's attorney, Jeff Ashton, I believe his name is, published a report clearing the agent, FBI agent Aaron McFarland, of wrongdoing in shooting Todashev. He was shot 7 times, including twice in the back. Reportedly, the FBI agent, as well as a Massachusetts state trooper who was in the room. So what we know basically is that 2 state troopers, one who is assigned to the violent fugitive task force, he's basically a fugitive hunter, and one who was a detective assigned to the murder investigation in Waltham, as well as this FBI agent Aaron McFarland, went down to Orlando, they say in a hurry, a mad rush, to interview Todashev one last time. They'd spoken with him before, to interview him one last time because they feared that he was about to leave the country. That is, on its face, a hilarious statement to me, because if anybody can stop you from leaving the country, it's the FBI. Especially if this guy was connected in any way to Tamerlan Tsarnaev, they would have had no problem stopping him from leaving the country. So I find that to be bizarre on its face, that they had to rush down to Florida to interview him at his home at night. This was a guy who, if you will recall, was a very powerful mixed martial arts fighter. He was very strong and physically threatening. In fact, I heard that the first time the FBI interviewed him, they sent 7 agents, and they actually, while he was walking home up to his stoop, they tackled him from behind, 7 guys, because they were so afraid of his physicality. Justifiably, he was quite violent and had a hair-trigger temper, reportedly. But then, his last interview, which, by the way, they promised him would be his last interview, it certainly was, they only sent 2 guys into the room at his home, highly unusual behavior. Typically they would want to have him in a secure environment, somewhere they could control what was going on. No, at night they interview him at home, just 2 guys in the room. So there's already a lot of stuff that seems unusual, suspicious. And then, of course, the next day, the FBI's initial statements change about 40 times. Like I said before, first the story was he came at them with a pole, then it was a knife, then it was a broomstick. It's like a candelabra, a samurai sword. I'm not kidding. You can read these reports in the press. And then finally they settle on the story that he's sitting at a table, not unlike this, writing his confession, confessing to this murder. Susan Zalkian, who I think might be in the room, has reported that the things that he wrote down in this confession didn't even comport with the facts at the crime scene in Waltham. So there's some, strange stuff there. Flips the table. Somehow the table boomerangs and lands on the back of the FBI agent's head, giving him a giant gash in his head. There are photographs of the FBI agent's wound made public. And then runs into the kitchen, shuffles to find a knife, and boom, boom, is shot somehow in the back twice. So this is what we're told, and the FBI as well as the Florida State's Attorney, cleared the FBI agent, Aaron McFarland, said the shooting was justified. FBI officials have been cleared in 150 out of 150 shootings over recent years, as Charlie Savage of the New York Times documented. So, yeah, I mean, there's one of the things that I find to be the most bizarre, honestly, about that case is that some of the text messages between the officers that night were printed, actually, in the state's attorney's report in Florida. And the next day, after Tarashev was killed by the FBI, one of the officers texts to another one. I'm paraphrasing, but you can look this up. It's on my blog. "Great job, men. We got through it, and now we're headed home." So I'm confused about that statement, because if I were police officers who thought that this man perhaps was the only living witness to a savage and brutal triple murder in Waltham, Massachusetts, where 3 men nearly had their heads decapitated, they were sawed so far, marijuana dumped on the bodies, lots of cash left in the house, truly bizarre crime. If you had killed in an interrogation the sole remaining witness to that crime, I don't think that it strikes me as weird that you would then text, "Good job, we got through it, we're heading home." It's not a conspiracy. I mean, you can look it up. It's in the Florida State's Attorney's report. I find it to be truly bizarre, and I don't know. I don't know what happened. The government's mum, any information about the murder investigation is not being released because the government says that the Waltham murders are still under investigation, even though they've also said at times that the 2 prime suspects are both dead, both of them at the hands of the government. So, yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine.
I had a question.
Let me add a word about the reaction to the Hampton assassination, which is quite illuminating. There were some local protests. The biggest one by far was in Chicago, where the assassination took place. Actually, I flew out to Chicago for the funeral a couple days later. There was a massive funeral, must have been 1,000 people there. Strikingly, there were almost no white faces. And that's reflected in the coverage and the memories and the way it was dealt with. It simply did not enter into the national consciousness. There was virtually no reporting, some, but not much, because it wasn't considered significant. So what if the National Police organized and carried out a Gestapo-style murder of 2 black organizers? Who cares about that? Very strikingly, this happened at the same time as Watergate, almost the same time as Watergate. Everybody's heard about Watergate. What happened at Watergate? Nixon called some people bad names. There was an enemies list. Nothing happened to anybody on the enemies list. I happen to know that because I was on it. They didn't even investigate tax returns. And it wasn't because I was on it. It was because the head of IBM was on it and McGeorge Bundy was on it. So calling important people bad names in private, that's a real crime. The foundations of the Republic are crumbling. A couple of other things like that. If you take a look at the Watergate indictment, first of all, things like the murder of the COINTELPRO and the murder of Hampton, of course, that's never even considered. Who would care about that as compared with Watergate? But there was one crime on the original indictment that was actually meaningful, the bombing of Cambodia. It was taken off. That was not part of the indictment. All of that tells you something. It tells you what we consider a crime. We, meaning the coastal intelligentsia, who I quoted before, the liberal establishment. It's not a crime to murder black organizers in an operation run by the National Political Police. It is a crime to call important people bad names in private. That's really terrible. And just compare the coverage and the memory of just these 2 events, Watergate and the Hampton assassination. You learn a lot about the prevailing moral and intellectual culture.
I just want to add one thing. You know, I disagree a little bit with what you said about how things were worse under COINTELPRO. I mean, for one thing, the FBI has access to information about all people that, you know, Hoover would have salivated over, died for, perhaps, certainly killed for.
Well, you're right about the information, but take a look at the actions.
Well, on the question of actions, I think the government has gotten smarter about how it pursues its, you know, devious intelligence activities. So, you know, are they murdering activists in their beds? No. Are they incarcerating activists and journalists? Absolutely. For long prison terms in federal prison. You know, the prison population.
Doing it for Leonard Peltier.
Sure, yeah. One thing, though, Marcy Wheeler, who's a writer who talks a lot about national security issues and stuff, has said, she said something like this: Why are people so worried about drone strikes on U.S. citizens, people like Rand Paul, when the FBI and the police can kill people and get away with it? They never go to prison for killing people. So, I mean, you know, the question of political assassinations in this country, I think, you know, a couple years ago, a young man named Kamani Gray was shot dead by the New York Police Department in the street. The police claimed he had a gun and that he was waving at them. Everyone who was in the street watching the murder take place said that there was no gun. The police completely lied. They rolled up on him. 2 plainclothes detectives jumped out of the car and shot him dead. You know, they got away with it because they're police, and police don't go to prison when they shoot young black men. So, you know, the question of whether or not the government has simply changed its tactics, or, you know, it seems to me to be impossible, actually, for police or FBI agents to actually get in trouble for shooting black people dead. And so that hasn't fundamentally changed, I guess.
Oh, I think it has. Take a look at the state troopers in Jackson, Mississippi in the early 60s. Police just can't do that anymore.
You mean shoot college campus?
Beat them bloody, murder them, killing them when nobody's looking. I mean, it was monstrous. It's, you know, look, what you're describing today is bad, but I think we should not overlook the fact that there's a history that's actually much worse. I mean, just take repression. Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare practically destroyed independent thought in the country, destroyed the unions, kicked thousands of people out of the country, plenty of violence, and that was Woodrow Wilson, you know, liberal administration. COINTELPRO went through the most liberal administrations in American history, Kennedy and Johnson. And murder of Fred Hampton was just the peak. There were other killings, there was massive repression, there was breakup of political movements, there was pretty awful interference with personal lives and political action. And there's the history of really oppressed minorities, like, say, blacks, is incomparably worse. Nothing like that is possible now.
I have a question that's a little bit related. Sorry, were you finished? I'm not trying to interrupt anybody. But in terms of like comparing, I guess, different moments in history, I'm curious about what each of you would say about the role of contemporary protest, right? I read a piece, I forget where this week, that was about sort of the nature of solidarity and the language of protest that we use, right? Like after Ferguson, it's, after the murder of Eric Garner, it's "We Can't Breathe," or it's "Je suis Charlie," whatever it is, it's all about the inclusiveness and the show of solidarity. But Noam, you invoked the film Selma, right, which shows us the sort of very different historical idea of what a protest is, which involves a very different look at leadership and the machinations that go on sort of behind the scenes. I'm sure a handful of people, at least in this room, have been involved in local protests, and I know everyone has different opinions about what the experience of doing that is or what the reason they have for doing that is. But I'm just sort of curious what each of you think about the efficacy of that, how that's being organized today, what we can sort of expect down the line in terms of that kind of organization. I guess in a bizarre way, I'm sort of asking, like, what are we supposed to do? But I think that's the sort of something that's on people's minds. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't see why the And one should think that the prospects for long-term political mobilization and activism are harder today than they were, say, in Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi in the early 1960s, or in the 50s or the 40s, when the background of the civil rights movement began. I think they're much easier today. It's not that it's easy, but yes, so there'll be plenty of surveillance of what you're doing, but that's, it's a burden, but being beaten and killed by the police is even a worse burden.
Regarding the, back to the Tsarnaev trial a little bit, thinking about the secrecy surrounding it and also the fairness of the trial, I'm wondering if you can speak to something that you didn't mention yet, which is, it's my understanding that Jahar Tsarnaev is under a gag order. He's not been able to speak to anybody about his motives or anything. All we have are some sort of cryptic scrawlings on a boat. And if, making the comparison again with the Timothy McVeigh trial, one thing that is more fair about that was that he was able to speak freely about why he did, it was in response to Waco and Ruby Ridge and the actions of the ATF and the FBI in slaughtering people at Waco. So could you speak to that gag order a little bit, please?
Yeah, so what you're referring to are these things called special administrative measures. If there's a more Orwellian term for the thing that describes, then maybe it's special administrative detention. I don't know. But yes, these SAMs, as they're called, forbid Tsarnaev from speaking to anyone except for his immediate family and his lawyers. So yes, he can't talk to the press, he can't give interviews, he can't write statements that can be read by the general public. I'm not sure that his lawyers would let him, even if he could, but he can't. The government won't let him. Also, the government is monitoring all of his communications with his family. They monitor the visits, record, as far as I understand, actually wiretap his conversations with his family when they visit him. And those SAMs are not unique to Jahar Tsarnaev. I think it's really important to remember that since 9/11, the government has created this special category of prisoner. There are super maxes now. There's one in Illinois. In fact, the federal government is thinking about building a new one where Obama wanted to move the remaining Guantanamo detainees before the Republicans barred any federal funds from being spent on such a maneuver. And at these special super maxes, where literally the only people in them are Muslims and left-wing so-called terrorists, so eco activists who lit fires at SUV dealerships, people like that. There's nobody else goes to these places, and their communications are extensively monitored by the Bureau of Prisons. They have very, very restricted rights in terms of what kinds of publications they can access while they're incarcerated. So yeah, this kind of treatment that Jahar Tsarnaev is subject to during the trial is likely to extend for the rest of his life.
We have a lot of people here who are very much part of the social media and the internet and the new media, and I wanted to ask, what are your reflections on all this access to media electronically that we have today? Has that made a difference, or is it there's some very regressive factors with that too, but I just maybe want your thoughts when there were so many more gatekeepers.
It's got very positive aspects to it. You can get access to information and material that would have been very hard to get before. You can read Glenn Greenwald's regular reports. You can find out information from the foreign press. There's things that you would have had to do intensive research, individual research for not long ago. You can now pick up in the morning by just a couple of keystrokes. And you can also, there's plenty of, you can present your opinions, your interpretations, there's discussions, there's debates. Things that would be very hard in the past are now much facilitated. Practically all the organizing that goes on today is through social media. which is, of course, far more effective than just trying to find people. So all that's positive. But there's a negative side, too. In practice, it tends to separate people from one another. It tends to set up superficial relationships instead of real, live, personal relationships. And it tends to trivialize a lot of communication and interaction, and also to divert people. A tremendous amount of it is just diversion. And that's harmful and negative. So I think it's kind of like just about any technology. The technology is kind of neutral. What the impact of it is up to us, how you decide to use the technology. And you can use it as a very significant force, but it's an effort and a battle like anything decent.
Cade Crockford, Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.